Hi, Mickey.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Pretty good.
Good.
Good to be back.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed your day off.
I did.
Yeah. You earned it. As you informed me, we've been nominated for an apparently serious award.
I guess it's serious.
I think it's not entirely trivial. It's these weblog awards. I mean, we weren't nominated for. It's not for best overall blog. It's for some subcategory. I think it's best purple and green video blog or something like that.
I think the thing is that there's so few video blogs out there that even though we've only been in existence for 3 weeks, that we're already one of the best.
That's a really negative way to look at it, Mickey.
Okay.
But anyway, it is for best video blog. We'll even post the link because there's only 3 more voting days, and you can vote once a day, by the way. And you can do with that as you will. What else? You called my attention to this Henry Kissinger op-ed.
Yeah, it's sort of depressing. We've seen Henry Kissinger's strategies for withdrawal before, and it sort of made my heart sink. But what was your reaction?
Just that we've seen so much of Henry Kissinger in general that whenever I see his name, my heart sinks. Actually made me think of the time about 15 years ago when Mike Kinsley was hosting a PBS debate involving Henry Kissinger, and at the beginning, Mike said jokingly, "I've always dreamed of the day when I could say, Dr. Kissinger, your time is up." And I think after reading this op-ed, maybe the day is pretty near when we can say, Dr. Kissinger, your time is up. There's a certain amount of cerebral rigor mortis, I think, evinced.
What was so terrible about it?
Well, I just think he's kind of locked in a Cold War way of looking at the world. It's not that I disagree with the conclusion of the piece. He's against withdrawing from Iraq. It's just that the way he got there seemed to me to leave out the dimension that is new about the current situation compared to the Cold War. I mean,
he's applying the domino theory, which he applied to Vietnam, to Iraq.
For starters, yeah. That's not quite what bothers me, but you're right.
He's basically saying, first it's key to perception, so we can't seem to be weak to the world,
right?
Or that will give encouragement to our enemies. In Vietnam, there had to be a decent interval before we withdrew, or else the dominoes would start falling and communists would be energized.
Right.
That wasn't the case then, because we withdrew from Vietnam humiliatingly and communism still collapsed. But it seems sort of more appropriate with radical Islamists, because if they are, given sustenance by humiliating American defeat in Iraq, that could really come back and hurt us.
I think in that sense, it would energize them if we're seen as being driven out of Iraq. But there's a whole another side of the equation that is just new this time around, and that is that part of the problem, and in a way the ultimate source of terrorism, is just grassroots hatred of America. And most people agree that our ongoing presence in Iraq, particularly as it is played out and given the kind of publicity it's tended to generate, has exacerbated the hatred, has been an asset to terrorist recruiters. And I'm not saying that fact outweighs the argument against withdrawal. Again, I don't think we should withdraw right now, but you have to at least take that into account if your argument's going to be taken seriously. And Kissinger just evinces no awareness of that whatsoever. He's just back in Cold War land. And there's a little epilogue here, a little story I could tell you about my brush with greatness, if you'd like to hear it, Mickey.
I always like those, Bob.
Well, I actually had a 2-sentence conversation with Henry Kissinger, and just to give you some idea of how casually I rub elbows with the most powerful people on the planet, we were at adjacent urinals at the time. Okay.
There you go. It's an old Hunter Thompson technique. It works every time.
Yeah. Well, anyway, the funny thing is the subject was this very thing. It was a continuation of a dialogue that had started. We were at a conference, and I had asked this arch realist, realist in the sense of a particular foreign policy worldview, John Mearsheimer. I had traced out the future world as I saw it, a world in which grassroots hatred is very lethal and so on, and there are weapons of mass destruction, blah, blah, blah. I said, what do you do? And he said, well, frankly, realism isn't designed to do that. Realism begins with a presupposition that nation states are the primary actors. Kissinger took umbrage at that. He said, no, realism can do anything. And then he reasserted that, in the bathroom. But he never elaborated in either case, and he still hasn't. I mean, his worldview has still... But mainly, I just wanted to impress you with what kind of bathrooms I go into.
That is impressive, and we wouldn't want to apply the domino theory to that, but it does seem to me that he is trying to bring the Iraq War back into a realist framework with all this talk in his piece about... And Biden said this on This Week yesterday, too. We need a contact group of governments in the region to do something, basically tell the allegedly sovereign Iraqi government what to do. And it seems to me that one of the whole neoconservative purposes of the Iraq invasion was to destabilize all these governments that we now, many of which are Arab dictatorships, that we now want to bring back into the process through this contact group. So Kissinger basically wants to sort of contain the problem of Iraq and embed it in this regional status quo that it was our whole purpose to disrupt.
One of the many ironies this war has generated, I would say.
But that's another reason why I think his advice... I mean, he was always a lukewarm supporter of the war to begin with, if that.
Well, he says in this piece that he supported it, although you're right, he was pretty ambiguous.
But he was ambiguous. He sort of tended to support it in a very muffled and hard-to-read way. But obviously now he would lose all credibility if he said I opposed it.
Right.
So, I mean, you sort of have to take that with a grain of salt.
Well, anyway, I think his time is up. I vote that we expel him from the realm of policy discourse.
Well, at Newsweek, we used to call his incomprehensible and unread pieces hood ornaments, because they sold magazines because you could bill Henry Kissinger on the coming global war or whatever on the cover,
right?
And people would buy it without necessarily reading it. And I even found like a horrible typo in the middle of one. I think there was a
and you were the only person.
And not only was I the only person who found it, but the editors sort of didn't really even care.
Yeah.
The assumption was that nobody was
going to come across that piece of trouble.
Nobody was going to read this thing. Yeah.
Yep.
We've settled his hash.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm ringing the bell.
Now, on Sunday, I think David Brooks answered the long-standing question: what does a columnist write about when he seems to have run out of ideas? The answer is he writes a column about the dearth of ideas, complaining about the failure of other people to generate ideas, in this case Republicans. He says there's hope on the horizon because a couple of young guys wrote a piece for the Weekly Standard, that young, needless to say, conservatives. You actually read not only the Brooks column but the Weekly Standard, and was it in the Weekly Standard?
It was in the Weekly Standard, and yes, I and it wasn't easy. So I earned my blogging head salary this week. Brooks's column was more than that. It was sort of interesting. He's never been a far right conservative, and he wrote this column where he talked about how we have to worry about rising inequality and new stratifications and the lack of social mobility and wage stagnation, all sorts of things that I didn't know conservatives actually worried about. What it portends is a coming split, I think, in a conservative crack-up that would be completely evident if conservatives weren't bound together over the Iraq War and foreign policy. Basically, there's this whole wing of Republican conservatism that is ready to sort of bail out on old right-wing ideas of limited government, low taxes, don't worry about inequality, don't look to the government to solve your problems. They want the government to do a lot to solve our problems. They are worried about inequality. And that's the pitch in this Weekly Standard piece.
Well, in theory, these are George Bush conservatives. I mean, according to the way he billed his candidacy first time around, right?
Well, right. Well, Bush is sort of in a very muddled and unsuccessful way sort of polluted the old conservatism, and many old-style conservatives are now bailing out on him because of the rising deficits, the Medicare prescription drug package, all sorts of big spending bills that are sailing through Congress. What's interesting is that this is obviously the basis for the McCain candidacy. So McCain is sort of going to continue this march away from traditional conservatism, and it seems to me that at some point the real conservatives are going to split off to the right. This Weekly Standard piece was not very satisfying. It started as all bad political pieces do, I think, with an analysis of how can we win the next election. We're losing white working class women, and it builds up how can we serve this constituency. And to spare you the tedious details, the solution is we need things that give them security. The Republicans have won the battle to secure freedom, but with freedom has come insecurity. So they now need to address the insecurities of not rich working class people through solving the health care crisis, through an elaborate system of wage subsidies I don't quite understand, through various sort of tax bonuses for families. It looks like a bunch of little sort of government sort of subsidies to the target group that they want to bribe. I would prefer something that started with some sort of lofty principle saying, why do we care about equality in the first place? When I thought about it, it's not because we care about money inequality, it's because we care about social equality, about Americans treating other Americans as equals.
You know, that reminds me of a book I once read.
Right, that was what I tried to discuss in my book.
Oh, you wrote it. You wrote it, didn't you?
I did write it, and I actually have a copy here somewhere, but...
well, I have one somewhere.
Here it is. There you go.
It was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review.
Thank
you, on the cover, Bob. Quite favorably. But go ahead.
But
I know you'd never say that about yourself.
There are all sorts of policies that might flow from that. Some of the same policies, it seems to me that that's a better way to start. For example, health care could be justified as it guarantees social equality because basically everybody's in the same health care system. If you pursue the Republican solution to health care, which is to require everybody to get private insurance, they're probably going to end up in very disparate health care systems. Some will get good care, some will get bad care, and you won't have the sort of socially equalizing effect that Medicare has now. Nevertheless, I think it's a good sign that people like Brooks are sort of explicitly betraying conservative principles as opposed to doing it seemingly through lassitude and just sort of whoring after votes.
Yeah, but I have a question about the social equality stuff. I mean, part of the idea in your book, one of the places where social equality is affirmed is in public spaces, right, where people of different classes come together.
Social equality sort of is almost always enforced in public spaces. Look at the rules. Look at the rules of the road. Rules, people driving cheap cars don't have to yield to Rolls Royces.
No, they don't. But
everybody obeys the same rules.
It's a good example because I maintain that the vogue for privacy glass, those darkly tinted windows, which I went to great lengths to avoid in a car we recently had to buy, I think those are a sign that more and more Americans are willfully segmenting themselves off, insulating themselves from people alien to them when they enter the public realm. And technology is abetting this. People do more and more. They're communicating online, and they arrange to meet people online, and so they wind up having fewer kind of the random encounters you had in the traditional, kind of town square. I mean, a place like Starbucks. Let's face it, not everybody can shell out $3.50 for a cup of coffee on a regular basis. That's a particular segment of America. So I think there are fewer and fewer public spaces available and less willingness of people to enter truly public spaces. And so put that in your book and chew it.
Well, I think that's right. That's the big problem facing social egalitarians is that people are retreating into their private realm. Robert Wright wrote about this. A lot of people have written about it. It's a true phenomenon. I don't think things are as far gone as alarmists would say. I mean, I was walking with my mother around our park yesterday, and we ran into her old gardener who was not a rich guy, and he stopped his car, and we chatted, and it was all very pleasant. He's a nice guy. This is in the middle of Beverly Hills, so it does seem that, I think there's plenty of class mixing that still goes on, even if there's this tendency to want to wall yourself off. And the reduction of crime is the key to bringing back public spaces. I mean, there was a fad for gated communities about 10 years ago. Then when crime went down, gated communities looked pretty stupid, didn't they?
So has that waned? Are there fewer gated?
I think they're coming. I think gated communities are actually coming back because rich people are so rich that they can afford them. But it still looks pretty silly. I mean, the rich people I know in Los Angeles do not live in gated communities, and there is a boom, I think, in building them for sort of upper middle class people who are sort of paranoid, but it's not like it was during the high crime era of the Carter years. So, in healthcare, my father was reasonably affluent, and he went in Medicare. He was in the same waiting room as plumbers and poor people, and everybody was concerned about a living. They weren't concerned about how much money they had. And I think that was a good thing. I just don't, the trend is there. You just have to fight it. That's
no,
the point.
Agree. I agree that healthcare is a kind of particularly invidious form of distinction that transcends the monetary terms involved.
Yeah, I have great trouble justifying why I think the government should guarantee health care to everybody, since I don't think it should guarantee anything else to anybody. And I keep going back to the analogy of everybody's, in the playing field, people win or lose, but everybody's allowed to be healthy enough to get on the field. And it's a sort of very fundamental affirmation of social equality that you don't let money decide who lives and who dies. But I haven't taken it much beyond that.
Well, anyway, even that line belongs in some politician's speech, Republican or Democrat.
But so I don't think McCain is there, and I think it's sort of a hodgepodge of little tax breaks, the way these Weekly Standard people outlined it. And Brooks didn't give exactly a ringing endorsement. He just said these people are closer to where Republicans are than conservative theorists. But I do think that this convinced me that the crack-up is coming.
Okay. Can you ring your bell?
Sorry.
Well done.
I rang the bell on myself. Sorry.
Yeah.
I have
it's a job somebody's got to do.
I have a hesitance against that.
Quick note from China, which is actually kind of good news. There was this riot a few days ago that was triggered by the government just kind of heavy-handedly intruding on a local area and pursuing some imperative, I think building a power station, with more or less indifference to the effect on the populace. So there was a riot. A few people were actually killed by the police. Now, to begin with, I took that as an affirmation of an argument I made on this very show, I don't know, a week or two ago, about how technology is on the side of pluralism and popular power and works against authoritarians, because in the news accounts it said that cell phones had been vital in organizing the movement that led to the riot, and also electronic technology keeps these groups in touch with international NGOs. And indeed, you will note that we found out about the riot very quickly. That itself is not the kind of thing that happened 30, 40 years ago. 20 years ago it happened in China. But during the heart of the Cold War, no, it was like airtight, information-wise, just about. But anyway, even better news, not that the death of the three people was good news to begin with, but I think that the unrest, the power of the people to generate that kind of unrest is a good thing. The government has detained the person who was in charge of the police, the riot police who did the shooting. So the government is siding with the demonstrators, and I contend that that's because they recognize how much power people have, and they recognize that there's a lot of resentment, and it is mobilized and empowered by information technology. The whole world knows about this, and it could get out of hand.
I thought you also claimed that repressive governments inevitably overreact and clumsily try to suppress dissent in ways that comes back and bites them.
They often do. This is a sign of enlightenment. And, China has, for a couple of millennia now, been unusually good at preserving order over very large expanse of territory. There's nothing comparable in terms of more or less political continuity. Of course, there have been upheavals and revolutions, but we're talking about a couple of millennia. There's a tradition of relatively enlightened leadership in China, so maybe they can make the transition gracefully. But whether, clumsily or gracefully, I think pure authoritarianism is on the way out.
How do they make the transition gracefully? At some point, they have to give up their perks and power.
That's when push comes to shove. Is when the question, when they have to give up, when the Communist Party has to give up power. Communism is already gone, so the party is already given up its actual legacy.
It's lost its ideological justification.
But it is still one-party rule, and that's when push will come to shove, and when you're most likely to have chaos, I think. But it could happen. It could happen peacefully. And in any event, I think it's in our interest to encourage a graceful transition.
I mean, every time something like this happens, there's a sense that, it might be happening next week,
Well, that's the mistake. I've never argued that. I've argued this is a long-term process. Nobody smart that I know ever argued that economic engagement with China would lead to democracy in 3 weeks. It's a very long-term process, but again, compare it to what we used to have. 30 years ago, China was a totalitarian communist state. Now it's an authoritarian, more or less capitalist state. That's real progress. And if it takes another 10 years to go all the way, and it happens gracefully, I'll be pretty impressed.
It could happen very soon, though. I mean, we already
could have upheaval very soon.
We already had Tiananmen Square, and that was premature, maybe, but there's no reason to think that it might not happen next year.
You could, but anyway, I don't think we need to really spend our time throwing fuel on the fire. I mean, there is enough pressure intrinsically headed the government's way.
Throwing fuel on the fire would be what?
Well, I guess, my main point is that the advocacy of human rights is not nearly as important a priority from our point of view as goals like, say, keeping North Korea nuke-free. And we only have so much political capital to spend on China. And if the choice is between agitating to get 3 people out of jail and keeping, North Korea nuke-free, I would argue for the latter, especially if they've already got their hands full handling this transition, and there's not necessarily anything to be gained by and maybe something to be lost by applying more pressure on them. I think the human rights lobby, very well-intentioned and a very valuable thing, exerts a largely malign influence on our China policy.
When you say handling the transition, what is there to handle other than preserving their power? In other words,
that's what they're going to try to do. But already you see a concession of the kind that, if it's repeated again and again, will push them to the breaking point, and they'll have a decision to make.
I defer to your greater expertise. So that sounds reasonable to me.
Okay. Well.
Okay. There was a development in the Valerie Plame investigation, which is that Time reporter Viveca Novak has now testified to the special prosecutor, and she's gotten into all sorts of trouble with her editors because she didn't disclose to them that she initially talked with the special prosecutor. That's all irrelevant. In fact, I don't think this development adds all that much. The case is still that the special prosecutor is trying to decide whether to indict Karl Rove for not telling him initially about his conversations with the Time reporter. In other words, it's a perjury charge, has nothing to do with the underlying disclosure that prompted this whole investigation in the first place. That's everybody's convinced that that's moribund. It is highly implausible that Karl Rove forgot about the conversation with Matt Cooper because it was all in the press. Cooper had been subpoenaed. Cooper had published about it. How could Rove not have realized that he was the source for Cooper's story for almost a year? But is it implausible beyond a reasonable doubt? I don't think so. So the fact that Novak testified didn't... Novak testified that she tipped off Rove's lawyer, and Rove's lawyer then found the email that he's saying prodded Rove's memory. It's hard to believe that Rove's memory needed prodding, and all that Novak's testimony does is it gets Rove's lawyer off the hook, but it doesn't prove that Rove's lawyer's client, i.e. Rove, didn't lie to his lawyer when he didn't bring up that he talked to this reporter. So
although the Wall Street Journal article, which is what I read, spun it a little differently. It said that her entrance into the case originally worked on Rove's behalf because it provided evidence that he hadn't told even his attorney about any conversation with Matt Cooper, the presumption being that you would at least tell your attorney. So last time you talked about this, you made it sound like to the extent that Viveca Novak had influence, it would be against Rove. This Wall Street Journal article made it sound like she was a pro-Rove influence and added credibility to his alibi.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. That you would getting his lawyer off the hook sort of gets him off the hook. But maybe he's such an insidious guy that, he doesn't even tell his lawyer the truth.
Karl Rove?
He's also
you think he would mislead someone?
He's also famous for having a great memory, which is not the reputation you want to have if you're in his position.
No. So what? So are you still betting what? For indictment against what?
I'm betting he won't be indicted, but it's close, like 51-49. I bet heavily that he wouldn't be convicted, however, if he's indicted, unless the special prosecutor has some evidence, like emails saying, ha ha ha, I'm fooling the special prosecutor, that we don't know about.
Well, I would find the indictment so gratifying that I could live with the acquittal.
You've adopted a straightforward, unprincipled position throughout on this, I believe.
Thank you.
Okay.
So where does that leave us? At the very end, or what? Is there more to talk about? Can you mention our nomination again? No.
No, I'm feeling a guilt trip coming on. I mean, I feel like I'm about to be guilt tripped over the movie Brokeback Mountain, which is apparently a wonderful movie about gay cowhands that I really don't have a tremendous desire to see. And, my first principle of journalism is my views and desires are the desires of the American people. I just don't think this movie is going to be a big hit, however good it is, because people don't want to go see a movie about gay cowhands. And I defend that. I mean, it seems to me if sexual orientation is in the genes, we are attracted to some things. We don't know why. It's just there. A lack of desire to see certain things can also be in the genes. Even a visceral repulsion can be in the genes. And that's nothing you can blame people for either. Yet I think we're about to see a wave of editorials and commentaries about how America's really homophobic because nobody wanted to go see this great movie. And I contend that would be self-contradictory.
Would be, I guess. But I don't know. Wait a second. Let me back up and ask a couple of clarifying questions.
Sure.
First of all, it's not clear to me why you would think revulsion against homosexuality would be in the genes. I can't offhand come up with a good theory as to why it would be.
Why isn't it that's the flip side of attraction? We are attracted to things and we're revolted to other things. And if one's
to be
in the
attracted
genes,
to women, you have to be revolted by men?
You don't have to be, but that seems to be the case.
Right, but being revolted by men isn't the same as, well, never mind. Anyway, I mean, I think, in a way, I'm not sure this matters anyway. I mean, if people have, for revulsion to be deep-seated, it doesn't have to be genetic. We all have reactions that at this point we're kind of powerless to fundamentally change that weren't destined at birth, but by virtue of the interplay of genes and environment, here they are. So I would grant you that maybe some people have a deep-seated revulsion. Seems you're getting a little ahead of the game, though. We haven't yet heard any complaints that the movie's lack of commercial success, which hasn't itself yet been manifested, I think, signifies some sort of homophobia. You're right. Maybe we will. I certainly agree that people should be able to go to whatever movies they want and not go to others. It's a little related to a question I find kind of vexing, which is the public display of affection question.
What's that?
Well, there are also a lot of people who are revolted by homosexual public displays of affection. I personally find PDAs a little grating regardless of whether they're hetero or homo, but anyway, it's kind of a similar question because you actually don't see much of it, even among people gays who are fairly assertive you don't see many PDAs. So I think there is this sensitivity to the fact that for some people have kind of a deep-seated reaction to that. And I'm just wondering whether the day will come when those are as common as heterosexual PDAs. I don't know.
I tend to think not, because I cling to this theory that the visceral counter-reaction isn't about to go away. I don't think it's cultural. I don't think it's very deep either. I think it can be overcome.
Well, okay.
I think I think it's visceral. There are places where there are PDAs all over the place, like Greenwich Village, but there are not very many of those places.
I don't see that many in Greenwich Village. Really. Maybe like on a Friday night, but late when people have been drinking. But I really don't see that many. In any event, the widespread revulsion against heterosexual PDAs has not wiped them out. So I'm not sure that will remain a powerful check forever. But
a heterosexual PDA has to be pretty explicit to get people's dander up, I think. Whereas two gays holding hands will gross some people out.
Yeah, no, you're right.
I think that's the way people are, and we have to live with it. I don't think it's.
I think you could have said that about racism. I mean, at a certain time, or the side of an interracial couple. I think some people, 30 years ago, I had relatives who were so freaked out by that sight.
No, that's true, but I
35 years ago.
I deny that the cases are different. Because, the cases are the same, because there is a difference between gay men and straight men in a way that there is.
There's a difference between black people and white people. One's darker.
Well, one is a difference related to an innate behavioral impulse, and the other is a difference in pigment. They're not even in the same ballpark in terms of how substantial the difference is.
Well, I just don't say why either should be particularly a candidate for a particularly deep-seated kind of genetically based revulsion. I think the jury's out, and people are more malleable than we tend to realize. Not in all ways, but.
Well, I mean, I live in about as liberated a community as you can find, and I try to do the right thing, and I have lots of gay friends, and I hang out with them, but I still have a little twinge of visceral repulsion. What can you do?
I don't know, but you never know if it would go away with enough exposure, because there isn't much exposure. I don't know. I do know we're setting a record for longest dialogue ever.
Okay, well, that's, there's more is more. That's not my philosophy, actually. We should probably end it.
Okay. I love you, man.
Okay. See ya.
See ya.